The music goes quiet again as two fighters approach the cage from opposite ends. One was a half-elf man, Ralith, who walked confidently, twirling around a well-made quarterstaff while wearing nothing but a loincloth as they proudly displayed their refined musculature. However, his confidence fell away from his face when he got a proper look at his opponent, and for good reason. On the other end was Crocs, a lizardkin man. Though he didn't exactly look like any sort of lizard to me, despite his name, he looked a lot more like a buff alligator who decided to get up on 2 feet while wielding a menacing-looking battle axe. I hadn't seen a lizardkin quite like him so far. Zasutir and Delreg heavily resemble monitor lizards, whereas Lostril looked like some kind of gecko, and the Crucible Master back in Sunspot Keep reminded me of a salamander. Most of the lizardkin I've seen looked like some sort of mixed blend of most domesticated reptiles I knew from back home in one way or another, but this Crocs was a beast of a beastkin in every sense of the word. Crocs readied his axe, holding it up and out as declared a confident challenge call. For the glory of the Seeker of Red Fountains. He bellowed while gnashing his powerful jaws with loud clacking chomps from his teeth crashing against each other. Ralith wasn't one for words as he suddenly lunged forward in a blur, swinging around his quarterstaff and making contact against the massive beastkin as the wood audibly clacked and smacked against Crocs's reinforced scales. Crocs, in turn, wheeled around on with Ralith with shocking speed before Ralith could attempt to put any sort of distance between them, his maw closed around Ralith's shoulder as Crocs ripped off a chunk of the man's flesh, sending an intense spray of red mist up in the air. Ralith could only clutch his shoulder as he backpedaled as far as the cage would allow him, his mana heart blazing with vigor as he managed to recover just enough to get the bleeding to stop. Meanwhile, Crocs appeared to become more manic at the taste of blood, a sneer forming as his tongue flicked along each of his teeth while his thoughts slowly faded to be replaced by a killer instinct. The massive gator soon roared out with gleeful determination while rushing Ralith, who in turn backed himself up to the line of bars that marked the cage's borders. Suddenly, in the second-to-last moment, Ralith forcefully coughed out a heavy puff of noxious green gas, which plumed out before duking Crocs by throwing himself to the ground to the right while Crocs was left blinded and coughing from the fumes after slamming against the cage bars. Back on his feet, Ralith swiftly moved up and got behind Crocs, bringing his quarterstaff down and cracking the wood over Crocs's head with a heavy snap. The hit looked like it hardly fazed Crocs as he rounded on Ralith again despite still being blinded by the green smog the half-elf blew out at him. The next moment, Crocs was suddenly brimming with mana, the energy almost overflowing as if someone had just poured water onto a grease fire when he lashed out with his axe and buried it between Ralith's ribs. Ralith only had a moment to process getting hit, his eyes darting down to the axe when the surge of energy coursed from Crocs's body, through the axe, and erupted into the Ralith's body as that and the follow-through of Crocs's swing launched Ralith across the cage and into the bars on the opposite side of the cage. The half-elf now sprawled out on the ground in a crumpled heap as roars of cheering erupted from the onlookers accompanied by the smattering of polite claps all over again. Crocs bellowed out a roar of triumph, raising his axe high as his thoughts came rushing back to the forefront of their mind. Glory! Glory to the Seeker! He declared, slamming his foot and tail down onto the cage floor as masked attendants unlocked the gates, hurrying inside to tend to Ralith while letting Crocs go off and do as he wished. What a frightening man! Basti commented with narrowed eyes, her tail lashing in anticipation of a challenging fight in the near-possible future. Crocs bellowed out a roar of triumph, raising his axe high as his thoughts came rushing back to the forefront of their mind. Glory! Glory to the Seeker! He declared, slamming his foot and tail down onto the cage floor as masked attendants unlocked the gates, hurrying inside to tend to Ralith while letting Crocs go off and do as he wished. What a frightening man! Basti commented with narrowed eyes, her tail lashing in anticipation of a challenging fight in the near-possible future. That's an understatement. Is this the way most fights play out around here? I couldn't help but ask as I watched the blood-soaked half-elf be carried off on a stretcher, mangled so easily and one-sidedly in such a way that would ruin any average human in my old life. The first fight was relatively evenly matched for the majority of the exchange until Delreg managed to outlast his opponent. But this last exchange was entirely in Crocs's favor from the outset, there was no way to dispute that fact, as the lizardkin hardly even had a scratch on him compared to the ruined half-elf. Basti rumbled a hum as she sat up from across my lap, her mind searching for the right words while serving herself a drink of something fruity and only lightly alcoholic. For most of the fights, you'll watch as part of the performances in this city. No, she said as she brought the cup to her lips, sipping from it quietly while leaning back against my chest and resting the back of her head against my wooden shoulder. I see, so these fights are the exceptions. I reasoned while reaching around and gently running my fingers through her hair and carefully poking at one of her ears, all of which earned me a small smile as she glanced up and met my gaze. There's a reason this sort of place is invite only. Most people don't have the stomach for these sorts of displays. Plus, those with the skills and means to fight at this level of ferocity don't usually put in this kind of effort for the relatively meager winnings at the daily fights. Basti explained while looking at the cage as the masked mags cooled the glowing metal with showy bursts of water. At least here, you get a considerable payout for just showing up and putting yourself on the line. Sure, higher risks demand greater rewards. I considered while Basti finished off whatever she had left in her cup, setting it back on our table before stretching and sliding back across my lap as the attendants began loading the next set of fighters towards each end of the cage. On one end of the cage was a thick-furred, almost hulking Borkin woman named Loying, wearing only a stained apron over a simple chest binding and a small pair of shorts that barely covered her body. She walked further into the cage with an almost lazy stride, casually grabbing at a well-worn yet clearly maintained butcher's cleaver. Despite her casual stance, her eyes held a rather intense ferocity as she closely studied her opponent. Her mana heart pulsed in response as the magically charged blood coursed through her body, causing light steam to rise from her fur. Entering through the cage opposite Loying was a half-orc with greyish-green skin named Rock, his body rippling with refined musculature as he wore only a pair of tiny shorts that barely left anything to the imagination. Wielding a traditional sword and shield, he readied himself as I felt his mind block out all his surroundings, entirely focused on the butcher woman standing before him, taking her in with his eyes as she became the only thing that required his attention for the foreseeable future. As his mana heart pulsed with vigor, it seemed to flare wildly for a couple of seconds, the single ring around his heart swirling erratically in a way I hadn't quite seen before. With seemingly no desire to trade words, Rock rushed Loying, his shield raised to hide most of his body before launching past it. He slashes at Loying rapidly before retreating on the back foot and ensuring he stays behind his shield. Loying's thick arms moved on instinct to intercept the orc's blade as it swept from side to side, preventing her most vital bits from being cleaved, at the cost of severe lacerations spanning from her wrist to her elbow. For just a moment, with the fur around her wounds soon starting to soak with sweet sanguine fluid, it seemed her opponent's sudden first strike had somewhat rattled her. Then, the moment passed. With speed and agility, one would think ludicrous considering her sheer size and weight, the Borkin ignored the fighter's stance and lunged forward with an open palm, striking the combatant's temple dead center with enough force to stun him seriously. As his defensive form faltered his shield-bearing arm along with it, Loying took full advantage of the opening by further launching two heavy fists into his now exposed gut and chest. The orc still dazed from the stunning strike he'd just received, the butcher's aggression didn't let up one bit, quite literally running circles around him as she threw a flurry of 4 quick blows at his bare body, the first landing clean on the side of his waist, the second glancing off the edge of his shield as it swung wildly around. At the same time, the final 2 kicks aimed squarely at the backs of his knees forced the fighter into a prone position on the floor before her as he regained his wits. Rock forced himself back up to his feet, blood dribbling past his lips before he spat out a bloody glob of spit, running his arm across his lips before looking up into Loying's eyes. I could feel his sense of dignity fade as he now strove just to win. Rushing towards Loying with reckless abandon, he lashed out with his blade, slashing the air with twin feints before crouching low and kicking at Loying's thick, muscled legs to little effect. Unfazed by the half-orc's strikes, Loying took 2 steps back, steadying herself with a single breath as she raised her arms, her thick fur positively drenched in her blood, even though the worst of the wounds themselves had already mostly closed up to a mere trickle, yet they still felt noticeably weaker by her own consideration. After a slow blink, Loying steadied herself, raising her arms and cleaver in a defensive stance as she eyed Rock more cautiously after recognizing Rock's change in demeanor. Noticing his opponent swapping to a defensive stance, he managed to wrangle his instincts. Instead of stepping on that blatant trap that Loying was setting for him, Rock swaps to a defensive stance, positioning his shield between the two and planting his right foot in front of him. The next 3 seconds resulted in a very tense staring contest, only broken by Loying as she decided to spring into action. She first flung her cleaver at Rock, soon following after it as she closed the distance and began to throw unarmed strikes via kicks and swipes of her massive hands. Yet Rock proved to be much more agile than moments before. With a subtle crunch between his teeth, I watched his mana heart surge with energy as it pulsed almost wildly. His already unstable ring spiraled even more erratically as he closed the gaps between Loying's wild swings, dragging his blade deeply along her inner thigh before bringing it up into her stomach. Loying could only grit her teeth, mustering what little of her fading strength she could gather as she forced herself to lock eyes with Rock, not allowing herself to fall while she still had the wherewithal to resist. When Rock released the blade, leaving it buried in her guts, she forced herself to take a half-step back before lashing out with an open palm, striking the half-orc against his chest and shoulder. Yet they hardly fazed Rock as he only sneered at her efforts as her strikes sounded like meat against stone. In response to her continual resistance to the inevitable outcome of the fight, Rock proceeded to toy with Loying, going out of his way to punch her in her arms and joints while occasionally throwing jabs against her face and stomach before even ripping the blade free from her body and wielding it all over again. Yet even as the fight turned to a one-sided pummeling of Loying, I could see a strange amount of damage accumulating on Rock as blood steadily dribbled out of his ears. Looking up at the soon-to-be victor towering over her through half-lidded eyes, Loying finally fell to her knees. However, with nothing to say, she grimly awaited the final blow to reach her as she saturated the cage floor beneath with blood. With a notable smug and sadistic satisfaction, Rock steps closer to his fallen opponent, his footfalls sounding distinctly heavier than they should be. His smile does not fall in the slightest. As he approaches the fallen Borkin, he raises his sword for one final, glorious strike. But it doesn't come. Instead, Rock's blade and shield clatters against the metallic floor of the cage while the half-orc himself begins to scream, his lone ring finally spiraling out of control and unraveling, his veins visibly glowing a bluish green as his mana heart erupts and floods his bloodstream with far more mana than his body could handle. Help! Help! Somebody help! Rock cries out, clawing at his throat as the veins in his face begin to glow, his eyes audibly sizzling in their socket while he desperately tries to draw a full breath. In the following seconds, the half-orc crumbled in a heap before Loying. The smell of flash-broiled meat now permeated through the rat pit as the corpse was left with webs of blackened veins all over their entire body. At 37 years of age, Loying had seen much, especially for a Borkin. The death of her father by the hands of bored mercenaries as a piglet, her run-ins with organized crime after moving to Crestport, even several odd jobs she'd once done that she swore to take to the grave. But the sight of what was once her foe in arms burning up like a candle right before her eyes, on top of the heavy wounds she'd sustained that were very much still bleeding her dry, was simply too great to bear. The butcher monk could only let out a weak gasp of shock before passing out altogether, leaving the question of what to do and how to react to this sudden turn of events to everyone else in attendance. It was only then that masked attendants were able to open the cage doors, rushing in to tend to Loying's wounds while others looked over Rock's corpse. Those in attendance didn't cheer or clap, most just engaging in quiet conversation after the sudden and very rare death that just played out before them. Well, that was gruesome. I can safely say I've never seen someone be flash fried like that without a lot of accelerants already present. I commented to Basti, glancing down at her as she wrinkled her nose and slowly sat up again. I can safely say I haven't had the pleasure of such an experience before now. Let's get going, I'd rather the smell not stick to our clothes. She said as she got to her feet, pulling me up by the hand to join her as we started looking for a free attendant to help us collect our winnings. We didn't have to look for long, though, as one found us instead, bowing their head in respect before looking up to Basti in particular. If you'll follow me, Sir Niall Tiro would like to make a request of you. At that, Basti glanced at me before bobbing her head once. Very well, If you'll lead the way.